much, but particularly right now, with efforts to get a peace negotiation started again in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. This book, which is called Israel is Real, an obsessive quest to understand the Jewish nation and its history, takes us back in time, as well as does a little bit of prognosis about the future. But first, a word or two about Rich. Rich has written 5 previous books to this, several of them having to do with Jewish issues, and several of them having to do with issues way out of the ballpark. Believe me, a lot of fun. He also is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and still Rolling Stone as well. Mm-hmm. And he's written for many other major publications. And he's written a screenplay. Yeah. Now, was the movie The Avengers based on that, or is it? No. No, this is still to come then. Yeah. All right. Okay. That and Thumbnail is who Rich Cohen is and how much he has written. But you can't really get a flavor of what a good writer he is unless you pick up a book tonight and read it. Now, Israel is real. It sounds like a non sequitur. Of course it's real. But there's actually a lot of meaning in why Rich chose that title. It's a major theme in the book, and I'll have you explain it.
Okay, well, when I was a kid, I really grew up in the 70s, and there was a big vogue for Israeli Hebrew t-shirts. The most sort of popular of them said Coca-Cola in Hebrew, which you still see, and there were a lot of different ones. And one that I had, that some of my friends had, I grew up in outside Chicago, said Israel is real. And it was just sort of a play on words, and that's why we liked it. But as I started to think about it, it's very simple, but it had this other meaning, which is for 2,000 years, Israel was not real. It was not a place. You could not get on a plane and fly there. It was like a city in the mind. You know, you had to reach a kind of state of religious ecstasy to get there, as opposed to get on El Al and eat bad food and wind up there. You know, so it was sort of Israel is real, I realized, as a statement of my grandparents, as kind of, for them, kind of a miracle and something that they never thought that they would see. And then over a period of time, for some people, Israel's too real, you know? And it's just, and also one of the things that I really thought was a lot of the problems that Israel has come from being real, which is that a lot of the virtues or traditions of Judaism really come from being stateless. You know, a lot of the religious ideas come out of the destruction of the Second Temple, going way back, and this idea of powerlessness, statelessness, and you see it in Christianity too, which is our kingdom is not of this world. But now to some extent with Israel, our kingdom is of this world, and if now you have a state and you're real, you need an army to defend that state, and you get into you get entangled with the world, which is in a way kind of Jews left history and came back to history in our own time. And I thought all that in some way was echoed in that title.
And you have some concerns about the fact that Israel is real again and the implications possibly for Judaism itself. But let's come up to that and first go back and do a little bit of historical contexting. In your book, you essentially said the idea of Judaism as an idea goes all the way back to the 1st century. Right. To a rabbi whose name was Ben Zakkai. Right. And that was an outgrowth of really what, I don't want to diminish the real one, but the first Holocaust, which was what the Romans did to Jews and to the territory. They literally destroyed the temple, most of Jerusalem itself, banned Jews from even coming into Jerusalem for, hundreds of years. Right. And it's from that you go from Israel as a tribal state, like everything else at that time, to Judaism as an idea, if I've got your thesis correct.
Yeah, I mean, you do. It's interesting. You said you don't want to diminish the Holocaust by using that word for it, but I don't think it doesn't diminish it because I grew up, and we don't really grow up knowing that how close Judaism kind of came to ending. And
how many here know that 90% of the Jews at that time were killed by the Romans? Go ahead.
And not only were they killed, but the entire country, which if you read descriptions of it, was forested, was completely devastated. And the Romans means of execution was crucifixion. So there were thousands of crucified Jews all over that territory, and the trees of that territory were used to crucify them. And to be very, very simple about it, there was a debate within Jerusalem during the Roman siege in that first war, because there were two Jewish revolts. And the debate was really between a peace party and the zealots, and about how you should resist Rome and occupation by Rome.
Right.
And it was whether you resist by accommodating or by fighting to the last man. And basically the zealots won that argument, and the peace party was discredited, and they fought to the last man, and they almost literally fought to the last man. Right. And a lot of the things that, when you go back and read the Judaism that came out of the destruction of the temple and the Christianity, because it was very close, to me, when you know that history, it's all about how do you live in a world where you're powerlessness and you have to accommodate. So you have render unto Caesar, which to me is sort of giving you permission to live. And there were Jewish thinkers at the same time that reinvented Judaism, because Judaism was a national religion with a temple and with animal sacrifice, and it was really attached to its place. You couldn't really be, there was a Jewish diaspora already, but there was a center, and the center was the temple. And there was a group of Jewish thinkers, Ben Zakkai you mentioned, who in the generations after the destruction of the temple were able to amazingly detach Judaism from its national place and make it universal.
Was it Josephus who?
Yeah, Josephus was the famous Roman historian, Jewish turncoat, who was a Jewish general in the war against Rome, and switched sides and helped Titus, I think it was, and switched sides, and then wrote this history. And to me, Josephus is fascinating, because he's a traitor, but you won't really know about a lot of this history if he wasn't a traitor.
Right.
So I always thought that he was sort of like the first Jewish writer of exile. He was like the first Philip Roth, kind of, in a way, because his treason made possible that we still know this history. And if you read his book, it almost is like a book that you could see canonized in the Bible. Of course, it wasn't. And one of the reasons it wasn't, and books like it weren't, is because the people who put together the books that would become sacred and holy wanted books that really didn't glorify fighting,
right,
didn't glorify fighting to the death, because they thought that way had been tried, and that way almost led to the end of Judaism. And I always thought that it was really interesting that Judaism survived. It was as if America had been destroyed, and 2,000 years later there are people wandering around the world who still consider themselves American. Even though there's no more country, and they've taken all the physical things of America and turned them into symbolic things. So you used to have animal sacrifice, where you'd go to the temple and sacrifice an animal, but you wind up with fasting. And the reasoning being, when you sacrifice an animal, you're giving flesh to God, and when you fast, you lose your own flesh, and you're giving that to God. And that might not be ideal, but that's what has to do until there's another temple.
Let me ask you about another thing that has a very ancient history, in fact, more so than I realized until I read your book. You mentioned in there, and it really brought me up short, that the hatred of Jews as a phenomenon starts 1,000 years before the crucifixion of Jesus.
Right.
So we can't just rely on the old tales that Christians mad about what was done to Jesus are responsible for. What, in your opinion, explains why the hatred of Jews has such a long history and is so prevalent even to this day? What characteristics?
Well, it's a mystery, It's anti-Semitism to me is almost like a religion. It's a matter of faith. People believe in it like they believe in a religion. And why it exists is mysterious to me. It's like, I don't know why evil exists. There's certain things that and if you think about it too long, you start to go.
But one of the things you say when we go back in history was that several of the reasons were, number one, they would not give up the principles of their religion to go back to tribal religions.
Right.
And secondly, They weren't going to bend to the Roman world, which was literally the world at that
Right.
time.
Well, that really is what they said in the ancient world, which is, and Gibbon said it,
Yeah.
in The Decline and Fall, which is that Jews are sort of refusing to go along with everybody else.
Right.
And it infuriated the Romans, which is they were clearly superior as far as they were concerned. They militarily dominated. They were the strongest. They had the best technology. They dominated in every way, but the Jews would not submit, and they would not give up their gods, and they would not acknowledge that the Roman gods were superior. And there was an argument where the Romans wanted their gods to be worshipped in the temple, and the feeling was that of the Romans, which is all gods can be worshipped in any holy place, and the Jewish feeling is there are no other gods, there is only God. They were monotheists, and they ultimately, all the rebellion against Rome had to do with that. And at first the Romans destroyed the temple and crushed the Jews, and then they ultimately basically flattened Jerusalem, built another city on top of it, and dispersed the Jews as a way to sort of, partly to end the Jewish problem, which was this constant rebellion, but also to sort of demonstrate very visibly which was superior. And also, I also think that because Jews are really the only people of the ancient world that are still around like they were in a really way, that it's like if you've been around long enough, you've had the most bad stuff said about you. It's like you're the object of the most gossip.
Now let's flash forward for a moment. You say in the book that going from the now long tradition of Judaism as an idea that is portable, that can be carried around the globe and influence all sorts of people, to going back to being an actual place with roots and temples and whatnot, has made Judaism vulnerable again. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, first of all, physically vulnerable, right? You see it with Iran, which is that, Philip Roth wrote this book, Operation Shylock, which was kind of a crazy book, but he talks about a second Holocaust because Jews, the generation after the Holocaust, have conveniently located themselves all in one place, which isn't exactly true, but it's much more true than it was. So very literally, physically vulnerable in a new kind of way. And secondly, there was the Zionists, the original Zionists had a utopian idea, and they had a great and a beautiful idea, but it had all kinds of unintended consequences. And which is when you go from it was a universal to the particular, suddenly you call all these other things into question, and you go sort of from the temple to the street. And you really get in a situation, like I was saying, where when you have an army and you're involved in wars, you're going to be involved in war crimes. I mean, that's every army that's ever existed, every war that's ever been fought. That's just the nature of war. And suddenly now you're defending this thing, and it just changes the nature of Judaism. And I always felt as a kid growing up, because I grew up very, very strong supporter of Israel, and Israel's kind of a religion for Jews in a way after the Second World War. But I felt like a lot of the basic things weren't talked about or questioned, because it was so close and the change is so enormous that it's almost too close to see how enormous the change has been. It's like you're sitting too close to the television and you can't make out what's happened.
Let me press you on this vulnerability issue a bit. Because a lot of people will say, look, the whole reason Israel was created, and very forcefully so, was because Judaism was so vulnerable over the eons. The crucifixion and its aftermath, the Inquisition, the Crusaders, the Holocaust, the pogroms, you name it.
Right.
It wasn't exactly a settled and secure world. What's the difference between that and the kind of vulnerability you see by creating a homeland as both a redoubt as well as a state?
Well, I think there's a Hemingway story where he says a man should never love anything he can lose, and of course that's everything. And suddenly now, if the Jews have a house, and if you have a house, you can lose a house, and that's a very different kind of vulnerability than being sort of stateless without a center. Now you have a center, and it's vulnerable because you try to imagine in your worst nightmare for me what would happen to Judaism if Israel didn't exist anymore. It happened in the ancient world, and it was saved by this group of rabbis and by Ben Zakkai and other people. But the question is, would that happen again? And would Judaism still be the same kind of Judaism if it was a post-Israel Judaism? And those are the kind of questions I want to ask. I don't know the answers to those things, because I'm just right here in my time. But I do know that Judaism is very attached to the state of Israel now, and that the state of Israel is a physical thing with an address that can be attacked and destroyed, and that's a change.
Okay, so let's focus on the state itself for a moment. You say there have been three Israels. There was the Israel of scrappy little country that everybody thought you could roll over pretty easily,
Right.
1948 to 1967.
Right.
So then there was Israel, the fighter par excellence from 68 to 73, 67 to 73. And then in 73, it looked like it was all over.
Right.
That war was lost before it was won again. We'll come back to that.
Right.
But from 73 on, you paint Israel as a city which is now entombed in its own walls,
Right.
kind of the Sparta of our era.
Yeah.
Is Israel, so Israel as a state has been very vulnerable ever since it was created. And one of the interesting things in the book gets into the fact that in each of these wars, the people who were in charge, understanding viscerally just how vulnerable the situation was, first broke down and then rose to the occasion. Golda Meir was talking about suicide and was crying all the time. Moshe Dayan went kind of bananas for a few days. And of course, Rabin himself had almost a nervous breakdown. All three, of course, got their act together and proved to be great leaders in time of a crisis. But it gives you some idea how, in this small country, how vulnerable people must feel from the top on down.
Right.
Do you think, because since 73 and the miracle victory, Israel has become both an economic power of some dimension and certainly a military power of the first order?
Right.
Is it as vulnerable today? Is it more vulnerable? Is it less? What do you see as the situation?
Well, I think it's more vulnerable because I think, just to be very basic about it, there's a demographic problem.
The Arab human bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And basically, when I was working on this book, I have a lot of family in Israel, and they're left-wing Zionists of the Hashomer Hatzir. They're kibbutzniks. And when I was working on the book, I spent a lot of time there my whole life, but I specifically said I wanted to talk to people that knew about this. And what I met was a lot of Israeli military leaders and a lot of Israeli generals who had been military leaders a long time ago. Some going all the way back to 48, some in 67, all in 73. And 73 always confused me because it seemed like when I would talk to my cousins, they would act like that was a near-death experience.
Right.
But when you look at it from an American perspective, the war was over in 3 weeks, and you wound up with more territory than you started with. What are you talking about? That doesn't seem like a near-death experience. But the fact...
Let me add a coda to that, because I'm sure you ran into this too. Military officers of the Israeli army have since said 73 may have been a mistake.
73 may have been a mistake in...
Getting all that land.
Right. Yeah. Well, then that's the other thing. But all these guys felt... When I was really talking to them, it was during the Second Intifada. So granted, it was a bleak moment, okay? But these guys were depressed. And they felt that Israel had made a mistake after 67 and after the Yom Kippur War they took sort of a wrong turn. And basically going out and controlling and building settlements in the West Bank was this terrible mistake. Because
Moshe Dayan was particularly vociferous on this, wasn't he?
Yeah. And Moshe Dayan didn't want to take East Jerusalem.
Right.
Because, now remember, we're saying that you had an idea, you had a place, and it became an idea and it became a place. But Israel was never exactly ancient Israel. Where Israel's located was not biblical Israel. It's near biblical Israel, but Israel wasn't on the coast. Biblical Israel was really in the West Bank. And that's where Hebron was, which was the
Judea,
first...
Samaria.
That's biblical Israel. And I almost felt like when Israel came into control of the Temple Mount and the West Bank and Hebron, it was almost like it was too emotionally and religiously intense. And it was almost like destiny that they were going to go out there and start building and taking those places. Now, it came in a vacuum, which was originally Israeli leaders wanted to trade that land for recognition and peace. And the Arab world said the famous three no's: no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. And it was sort of like, in absence of that, there was a pressure from a small group to start building settlements. And it was really Ariel Sharon who had a lot to do with it. But Sharon didn't do it for religious reasons. He thought militarily Israel was too narrow. It has this, what they call the narrow waist of Israel, which is along the coast, which is only 7 miles wide. And Israeli leaders, a lot of them thought it actually caused wars because it was provocative, because it looked easy on the map, and it caused people to attack. So Sharon's idea was to put settlements, to thicken that thin part of Israel, and put the settlements on roads, which had traditionally been the entry points for invasions, and thereby you'd extend an invasion by a couple of days. You wouldn't have the surprise situation you had in the Yom Kippur War. And the amazing thing that happened is that Sharon, the situation changed over a period of years. Suddenly you have missiles from Hamas. Settlements are completely useless. They just go right over the settlements. And Sharon changed his tactic, and at the end of his life pulled the settlements out of Gaza, and I think was planning to pull them out of the West Bank.
I want to talk about settlements for a bit because it's been very much in the news. Obama chose this as his spear point, so to speak, in trying to get talks started again, peace talks. We can come back to that. But the settlement issue itself, there are now, I think it's over 200,000 Jews on the West Bank. And of those 200,000, a very significant number are what you would call religious Zionists. And of the religious Zionists, a packload come from the New York area. In fact, about 15%. Now, they also have a very high birth rate, which means that while religious Zionists only account for 10% of the population, and this is in your book, you look at the first grade educational system in Israel, and it's 20%. In other words, Israel is becoming more fundamentally religious with the passing of each day. What does this tell you about whether settlements have any real good purpose at the moment in terms of protection, in terms of Israel's future, or is this now a talisman around Israel's neck that it's going to be hard to live with?
It's already impossible to live with, and it's sort of like getting into this conversation, it gets crazy, but the point is that if you go back and read Herzl and read all the people before Herzl and after Herzl, their dream was to create a state where a Jew could live a normal life as opposed to Europe. And where, in a sense, being a Jew would be so ordinary, in a way you could stop being a Jew and just live a normal life. And for the religious Zionists, who often equate themselves to that first couple generations 100 years ago, because they say, look, they were on the kibbutz, these are like settlements. The fact is, the goal is almost opposite, which is, to them, the land, that territory, is the thing. It's the only place you could live an authentically Jewish life. And you can't give it up, and the land becomes the thing. So you have this, and you still have this split in Israel. And in addition to the demographics that you mentioned, there's the political system, which is proportional representation with parties building coalitions, which means small groups with one issue, which are like interest groups, have the ability to bring down governments. So there are parts of a religious coalition that have a single issue, and the issue, might have nothing to do with any of this, but if you don't give them that issue, they can collapse the government. And that is one of the reasons why Israeli governments, even though they're elected for 4 years, tend to last about a year and a half.
Public opinion in Israel is quite different today than it was, say, 5 years ago, or when the Oslo peace accord was signed. I looked at some polls recently, and the two biggest issues on the mind of Israel's public are Iran and security in general. Peace talks have about 0.5% backing by the public at this stage, which shows a dramatic decline in faith that something can be done through negotiations. Does that square with what you found when you were there?
Yeah, basically you have two groups of two ideas, two general ideas, which is one, if you're Israeli, if you're Jewish Israeli, one is does the Arab world really want, the Palestinians really want peace with Israel?
Right.
Okay, is that real? Or is that some sort of, or do they still want the destruction of Israel and Israel to be replaced by an Arab state? And in the Oslo Accords, most Israelis believe that they did want, and because of the Intifada, and I saw it happen with my own family, people that were very left-wing, very for the peace, sort of thought, oh, so they don't really want it. You know, this isn't what it's about. It's what Yasser Arafat says in Arabic is what they really want, which is the destruction of Israel. And so that's what happened, and that's when that changed, and that's when Sharon was brought back in. Because remember, Sharon was in the political wilderness ever since the
Right.
82 war in Lebanon, and he would have never come back, but he was sort of brought back by the Intifada. And it's sort of like when you're being attacked, you know, it's like The Godfather when he says we got a wartime consigliere. You know, it's like you bring the strong man in the moment of crisis, and that's when Sharon came back. But yet, Sharon came back for that role to end the Intifada, which he basically did. But yet Sharon then went ahead and withdrew the settlements from Gaza, which is an unbelievable thing that no one expected.
But this gets us back to the demographic problem, which he understood at that point,
Right.
not before, which, just sketch it out.
Basically, Israel is a Jewish democracy in the Middle East. It's a Jewish democracy because the majority of its citizens are Jewish. Ever since 1967, however, it controls a lot of territory in the West Bank and formerly in the Gaza Strip, and once upon a time even in the Sinai, where there's a lot of Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel. And the effort since, say, the mid-'70s has been to create a two-state solution, which goes, you can trace it all the way back to the UN mandate in 1947. But the fact is, the feeling is that if the Palestinians, at some point, say we don't want our own state anymore, we want one man, one vote, okay, and you get into a situation 10 or 20 years from now, there's going to be more Palestinians, if you accept, you know, more Palestinians than Israelis in that territory, and that will be the end of Israel. So, because Israel will then be held up to its own standards, which are that it's a democracy, it's like in a country based on certain ideals, and at which point it has to either give up its position as a Jewish nation, or it has to give up its ideals, and it will cease to exist.
You're saying it can't be a Jewish state and a democracy at the same time.
Right. It only is because it's a majority of Jews, basically. It's simple as that. So, and Ariel Sharon knew that, and it's not just Ariel Sharon. Yitzhak Rabin was against this until he got into a position of power, and he looked at the reality, and he made the decision two states was in not only Israel's interest, it was absolutely vital. I think once upon a time they wanted to make a peace treaty with Jordan, and Jordan would control the West Bank, but King Hussein basically washed his hands of the whole thing and said, I don't want it. You know, so because that would be the end of Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you know, and then Sharon reached the same conclusion, and then you had Ehud Olmert, who comes from a very right-wing family. When he got into that position, he also came to the same conclusion. He was the one pushing Sharon in a lot of ways, and after he sort of was leaving office, I think, but was still holding the job, he gave an unbelievable interview, I think in Israel. But then it was carried in the New York Times, an Ethan Bronner story, sort of saying, we have to leave these places, everybody knows it, we're going to have to do it, you know. And it's not a matter of altruism. I mean, it's just a matter of survival. That's what I think. And it's
Now, one of the things that, however, is worrisome, I think, is at the very time that this consciousness is sinking in, let me put it this way, up until Oslo, the general thought was time is on Israel's side. Israel's getting stronger all
Right.
the time. And from Oslo on, it has been, time is probably on the Arab side because of the demographic picture, which is really awesome.
right.
At the time of Oslo, public opinion polls in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority showed, just by a sliver, but a majority of both Palestinians and Israelis in favor of a peace settlement. Today, both that's a minority position, both in Israel and among Palestinians. And this is at a time when it's quite clear to most Israelis that time is not on their side, that the demographic threat is a real one. What can be done about that? Because as long as there is no public trust in a potential settlement, it's difficult enough to get one without that, but without that trust, there's not going to be any.
Right. Well, it's really an impossible situation, and what Ariel Sharon tried to do was just do it unilaterally,
Right.
which is to say, okay, we're gonna draw our border, and we're gonna withdraw, and we're gonna put up a wall, and when they're ready somewhere in the future, maybe we'll talk to them, and we'll solve the problem. And if you look at it, I mean, when he was looking at the Gaza Strip, the most crowded place in the world, I think, he was looking at that immediately pulling out of the Gaza Strip pushes the demographics out by like 10 years.
Right.
Okay, and that's clearly what he was looking at, and he was looking at pulling out of places in the West Bank and drawing a border. The problem is the Palestinians don't let the Israelis withdraw, you know? So Hamas, so you have Israel still sort of in control of every part of the Gaza Strip, but not there, and you get a situation that's worse. So basically, you need to find a Palestinian partner that can do it with you. And a good lesson is sort of Lebanon. You know, because Ehud Barak became the prime minister of Israel. Ehud Barak was a commando. And Ehud Barak was in the unit that did the rescue at Entebbe. And Ehud Barak's hobby was building watches. You know, and to have that as a hobby, you have to have a certain kind of very intense mind. And he had this idea that I'm just going to do it. It's like the Band-Aid, just rip it off, we're just going to do it. And he tried to make peace with the Palestinians. It was going to be more difficult. Then he went to the Syrians, and then he just withdrew unilaterally from Egypt. But he didn't leave any kind of peace treaty. So as a result, you had Hezbollah became increased in power, and what it looked like was the Israelis got chased out. Who chased them out? Hezbollah, and that's how you deal with Israel. You fight against Israel the way Hezbollah fought against Israel, and very soon after Ehud Barak pulls out, you have, sort of Hamas, and you have the rise of Hamas and the Second Intifada with the same tactics as Hezbollah. So what Israel has a really bad habit, I think, of emboldening their enemies on the Palestinian side by seeming to only, do these things that basically bring Hamas to power.
Right. One last question, then we're going to go to the audience. It's about Arabs. You mentioned the three no's, which was the traditional position of all the Arab governments. What was it? No peace with Israel. What were the other two?
No recognition.
No recognition.
No peace. I think no negotiation.
And no negotiations. Now, when one talks about Arabs, there are the governments themselves. There are now these very lively and dangerous rejectionist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And then there's the average populations. There have been some changes, at least at the official government level, among Arabs. What's your current reading? Because it's very important in any kind of a settlement. What are the Arab states going to do? It would look to me, at least, as if the three no's now at least have sub-clauses to each.
I think there's an opportunity right now, okay? Whenever talking about opinion polls and everything, I always think of an E.B. White quote I once heard, which is, you can take a nation's pulse, but you can never be sure that nation hasn't just run up a flight of stairs. And basically, people's opinions change. You talked about the opinion of Israelis being sort of wanting peace and now not, and that could change back.
Right.
And basically, because of Iran, which nuclear Iran is feared as much by these Arab nations as by Saudi Arabia, as Israel, because Saudi Arabia did make this Tom Friedman peace plan or whatever it was, and it's on the table, because there sort of seems like there could be a common enemy out there. There's a moment where Israel, I think, hopefully can make peace with its neighbors and something good can come out of it. What you hope is that it isn't, a mirage, and it takes somebody to take a risk, and that takes a great leader. I don't know if they have that leader in place to do that, but I think Israel, certain countries are lucky in that they have good leaders, and America's been mostly lucky, sometimes unlucky, and Israel's been mostly lucky, sometimes unlucky. You know, but I do remember that Netanyahu was the one who signed the treaty that left Hebron.
Right.
And he could do that partly because it is like the Nixon goes to China kind of thing. He is positioned. But the question is, can he hold his coalition together while he does it? And it is now, like right now, you're in the eye of the needle. And I know you feel a lot of times like this is the last chance. But because of the demographics, because of everything else, it really feels like the last chance. And I believe if you could have a better situation for a number of years, their opinions would change and things would get better.
You know, neither one of us can read ourselves into Netanyahu's mind. But as you say, there are elements of pragmatism to him and the way he runs his office, heretofore anyway, that one can look to with some hope that that'll come to the surface. But if you had to guess, would you say that Netanyahu believes that maybe this is the last time, by last time I mean the next few years, to make a settlement or not? And if so, is he really, even whatever cards he's showing or whatever ones he's not showing,
Right.
is he really prepared to make a settlement, in your mind?
No, I don't think he is. I mean, in my mind, I think that right now he's really occupied with staying in power
Right.
and with his own situation. And I think he feels probably like the Arab leadership on the Palestinian side has not emerged that's going to make peace with Israel. And there was this famous, Zev Jabotinsky, who was the father of
Right.
the revisionist movement that became sort of the Likud, of which Netanyahu is now the leader, sort of said we have to build an iron wall. And after 100 years of banging against this iron wall, then the Arabs will be ready to make peace. And I think Netanyahu knows that, and he might have a clock, and he thinks it's not 100 years yet.
Yeah. Okay, well, the Iranians just did him a big favor by having one more nuclear plant exposed,
Right.
which has reinforced the argument which he's making at home, that Iran, not the Palestinians, are the number one issue for Israeli security. Yes, let's go to the floor. Yes, sir, right there.
Yeah, in relationship to security, Israel's been a great recipient, a tremendous amount of venture capital money.
Yes.
And it's been an innovative source for technology and medical innovation. Does that help its security at all? Does that deal with the issue of its lasting on and on and on?
Yes, absolutely, because, in I forget, well, one of the things that really happened in the Yom Kippur War, I know we're going back before the age of the venture capital, but one of the things that really happened in the Yom Kippur War was the Egyptians had gotten these surface-to-air missiles from the Soviet Union. And they basically kept the Israeli Air Force out of the battlefield, which gave the Egyptian army the ability to move across the Suez Canal and into the Sinai. And this was a problem that the Israelis could not solve for a long time. And ultimately they did solve it, and they solved it through technological innovation, which is they basically invented the drone, which you now see, which is the drone would activate these surface-to-air missiles. They'd fly like a model plane over. The missiles would shoot off the rockets, reveal their positions, and have to wait like 20 minutes until they were rearmed, and then the Israeli Air Force came in behind and destroyed the surface-to-air missiles. And that kind of innovation, that's just an example of it, are the kind of things that Israelis have relied on, have had to rely on because of, mother of necessity. Because they have a very small country, and technologically, it's been saved that way, and I do think that is what enables the Israeli army to be superior.
I had an international relations professor once who said to me, and the whole class, too much cynicism and you're not going to learn anything. No cynicism and you won't be in the real world. I have a little bit of cynicism about the effects of economics. It can have an effect. North Ireland is a very good example. Without the improvement in Irish economics on both sides of the border, there probably would not have been a peace. But time and time again in history, economics gets trumped by honor, patriotism, all sorts of human emotions that are more powerful than even bread on the table. And right now you have an Israeli economy that's not only technologically innovative, it's doing very well.
Yeah.
Next door, you have a Palestinian West Bank economy, which suddenly is doing very well. I think the growth rate is 4 or 5%.
Right.
So you have two economies next to each other beginning to take off. And you would say to yourself, well, gee, this is going to have to help a peace agreement. These people are going to say, we're making money now, let's keep at this. That's not what's going on. They're fighting as much as they ever did.
Well, it's fascinating because it's a whole materialistic idea, which is if you give people have good lives, but the entire existence of modern Israel is an argument kind of against that because it's about something that's metaphysical, you know, and it's this desire to be in this metaphysical place. And I remember that Tom Friedman had a famous, you know, his Burger King thing, countries that have Burger Kings don't go to war with each other until they did go to war with each other.
Yeah, that's one of those theories that was great on paper. Yeah, yes, sir, right there. Mike, coming your way?
I have a question about the demographics.
Demographics.
You know, I'm Israeli, and I was taught that Israel and Judaism, they're not ideas. They actually refer to our ethnicity, okay? Because Israel was really Jacob. Okay, that's the name that was given to Jacob, and so the people of Israel are the descendants of Jacob, and then Judaism. Judea was one of the sons of Jacob, and there was a tribe of Judea, and all of us are descendants of the Judean tribe because the other 10 tribes disappeared in the first Israeli exile. Now, Zionism was about not the creation of a Jewish state, but the creation of the nation state of the Jewish people, okay, which is an ethnic-focused solution. If you look at the demographics of the Jewish ethnicity, okay, then, you know, when I was a kid, there were more Jews in New York than in all of Israel. And when I left Israel in the 20s, there were more Jews in the States than in all of Israel. Nowadays, it's about equal. But in Israel, it's growing slowly. If you look at the Jewish population outside of Israel, it's declining. If you look at the demographic challenges facing the Jewish nation as an ethnicity, and you fast forward a few generations, do you see any Jews at all, you know, other than a few communities in Brooklyn, left really anywhere outside of Israel?
It's really fascinating, you know. And one of the reasons is, you know, there was this synagogue when Zionism was sort of getting launched as a movement. There was a synagogue in San Francisco that's still there, and I heard from the rabbi after my book came out. And it showed a stained glass picture of Moses carrying the 10 Commandments out of the Sierra Madre Mountains into San Francisco. And so there was really an idea that America, you know, that American Jews had that, well, why are we found the promised land, you know, it's here. And I met Yossi Beilin working on this book, and he sort of said, well, the dream of Zionism exists really, which is a complete normalcy, and that dream is in America. And I really think you see that with the vanishing demographics, which is, you know, one thing I always thought is, why did the Jews survive? And why didn't they assimilate and disappear like other peoples? And one of the reasons is because they were not allowed to assimilate. And in America they have been, and as a result, they're disappearing. And the kids that I grew up with who are Jewish, most of them, a large number of them, married people that are not Jewish, and it's not that important to them. And it's a scary thing. But you're talking about, that's the demographics of Jews all over the world, which is that Israel will be the place where Jews are in numbers, the only place in the world. And that makes everything else a little more intense and a little more scary, and it's sort of the real end of the diaspora.
Tell me if you disagree with me on this, but assimilation, whether it's of Jews and the rest of us, or whether it's blacks and whites or whatnot else, has gotten a lot easier in the United States as we've gotten more tolerant as a nation and as a society. But my understanding is that Jewish population figures have gone down primarily because of a low birth rate, which tends to be true of all of us who've gotten into the middle class. And there's not that much about assimilation being more than before. Also, there's not a linear pattern to this particular phenomena. It goes like this. I grew up in New York City, and when I was growing up, which was a long time ago now, on the west side of town, there was one synagogue after another that was in bad shape because assimilation was the big thing. This was in the 50s and early 60s. And the kids didn't want to have to take care of these old temples. Suddenly, starting in the late 60s and the 70s, a newer generation of New York Jews said, no, this is our heritage. We want to recapture what it was. And one after another, these synagogues were brought back to life. So
No, it's really
it's hard to really say because it's going this way now, it's always going to go.
Well, it's like the up the flight of stairs thing, too.
Yeah.
Because there, you know, if you read about 100 years ago, at the time of when Herzl was writing and after Herzl, one of his fears is that Judaism would disappear because people were assimilating. You know, and that was one of the things that Zionism was supposed to solve. And there was a fear, you know, and Herzl really felt that they tried sort of reform Judaism in Germany, and that wasn't going to work. And so you do have these periods where it seems bad, and it seems like it's going to disappear, and then it comes back. And in the 70s, it might have been partly because of Israel.
Yeah.
After 67, there was this fusion, you know, this burst of interest and everything else. So it's really interesting.
Way over there.
Well, another like answer to the demographic question is that you know, sometimes it's in a country's economic interest to
Talking to the mic.
sure to encourage fertility because otherwise it's a lot harder to pay for pensions for retiring people, and a lot of European countries you know, have like tax incentives and other means of encouraging people to have more children, and you know, it's another like economic cycle that could possibly.
Yeah. What's the question?
All right. It's not a question. It's a yeah, it's a remark.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, sir. Just a comment on that. The only birth control or birth expansion program that's ever worked over a number of different societies is creating an optimistic middle class in which material benefits are growing all the time. If that isn't in place, all the incentives of taxes and whatnot else ain't going to work. And the best example of that today is Russia, which has a number of different programs of government handouts and whatnot else, trying to get babies created again. And too many Russians don't want to bring up kids in the Russia of today. And so their population is going downhill. Excuse me.
I'm not sure if you addressed this, or I'm pessimistic about how you did address it, but will suspending expansion of the settlements allow peaceful coexistence between Israel and the Palestinians? And also, can Israel tolerate Iran's production of nuclear arms?
Two big questions.
Well, about the first one, I would say no. Okay, I mean, I don't think so. But the thing is, the reason why Israel needs to get its situation fixed is not because it's a favor to the Palestinians, it's because it's a necessity for Israel. And to me, that's the realist view. You know, the other view is that somehow God's going to take care of it and everything's going to be okay because this is Hebron or whatever. You know, the Israel, you know, if you could be a Palestinian, sort of say, our best strategy is the status quo. Just let time go by and let the demographics continue and then have one man, one vote. So Israel needs to take care of the situation, even if they're not going to result in recognition. As far as Iran, whether or not Israel can tolerate, they might not have a choice. You know, I mean, I hope it doesn't happen, but it's if they've got secret facilities all over the place, or, you know, they were said in 2002 they said they'd have nuclear weapons by like 2009. I mean, time is going by, nothing's really happening, and they might just have to find a way to live with it, like the United States had to find a way to live with Stalin having nuclear weapons.
Let me just add a quick follow-on question to that one, which is, let's say they go ahead and get to the point where they can make nuclear weapons in Iran, and we don't want to see a war. We would rather see a containment policy. What kind of leverage, if any, would we have over an Israeli government in keeping them from a military attack?
Only that they maybe don't have the ability to carry out the military attack without our help.
But otherwise, we couldn't stop them.
No, and I mean, Israel has a history of, and it's in the ideology, which is one of the things about Zionism, is Jews are supposed to take responsibility for themselves, and they're supposed to defend themselves. And they have a history, Israel, of doing that. Going back to the preemptive strike of 1967 when everybody told them not to do it, and they did it. And there's a really interesting quote by Yigal Allon, who's an Israeli leader, who sort of said before the preemptive strike in 1967, they will condemn us and we will survive. And that's the attitude of
I have no idea what they're going to do, but here's something to think about. A very high-level Israeli defense official said to me about 8 weeks ago, don't kid yourself. You're sitting here, you have an ocean and a whole continent separating you from Iran. We have 6 seconds.
Yeah.
So when you say the chances of them using nuclear weapons, even if they get them offensively, are 1 in 100, you can live with that equation. We in Israel cannot live with that equation. If there's even one chance, we have to try.
But they're a victim in that regard of their own success in Iraq and knocking out the nuclear reactor, which is presumably the Iranians learned the lesson. The stuff's hidden, it's buried very deep, it's fortified,
Oh, it's going to be really tough.
Yeah, so.
Really tough.
And what if they try to do it and they don't succeed? I mean, they have to have a plan for that too, and it's kind of very difficult situation.
Yes, sir.
I know it could be a confusing question, but do most Israelis accept the fact that can people convert to Judaism, or can they convert to Islam?
Well,
Since
does
it's one
Israelis
God,
accept
it's
that
the-
people can convert to Judaism?
Yes, can an Arab, a person who was Muslim become Jewish, and vice versa? Because it's one God.
Well,
Allah is.
A person who, you can convert to Judaism and it's accepted. It's just the way it is in Israel, it has to be done by the Orthodox, it has to be done correctly according to the Orthodox Jewish synagogue. But you can, and people do all the time. As far as can a Jew convert to Islam? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yes, but can a Muslim convert to Judaism? Well, then I don't think that's accepted in the Muslim world. So that's a whole other issue.
Yes, sir. Right there with the cap.
Thank you. Well, you talked about part of the original Zionist dream, the implementation of that dream. You talked about the unintended consequences. And part of the unintended consequences was the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, sort of. So fast forward in the future, you talked about the demographic problem. You have more than 500,000 Israelis within occupied territory, Palestinian territory, and you have more than 1 million Palestinians, well, Arabs, both Christians and Muslims within Israel proper. So the question is, okay, the only solution on the table right now is basically the Arab Peace Initiative, which isn't 3 no's, but it is, return to 67 borders. So, and it hasn't been accepted at all.
And the right of return. I mean, let's get this
Yes,
right.
yes, and the right of return, of course, which was added later. It wasn't original, but yeah, but it hasn't been. Israel hasn't responded to the Arab Peace Initiative yet. But just looking theoretically at the Arab Peace Initiative, it's impossible. Its implementation is impossible without of both. So the question is a 2-state solution possible without ethnic cleansing again? If not, can the Jewish psyche in Israel live with a binational state, both Arab and Jewish?
Well, I mean, I don't see how you have to have ethnic cleansing to have a 2-state solution. You can have the right of return because that's the end of Israel. Demographically, you can't have people whose grandfathers lived in, Lod or something or Haifa coming back and sort of because that would be, and there is a way to solve that. I mean, there is a way to solve that. Which is you make, and the fact is that there were a lot of Jews in Arab countries who were kicked out of Arab countries and wound up in Israel. So you get into that, then so it's like kind of like a what happens after a war. I mean, this thing happens where populations move. It's terrible, and it happened. And the fact is, I think that there is a way to solve it. And the way to solve it is, was kind of laid out. It's been kind of laid out, which is the borders would be roughly along 67, but not exactly. There'd be a swap in territory. I think that the holy places in Jerusalem, me personally, could be like a kind of a Vatican City where it's internationally controlled. I know people think that's crazy, but that's what I think. And that the people that are the sons and grandsons and everything else of refugees would get some settlement. And the people who were actually themselves displaced by the war, maybe there could be a thing where they could come back. And that's a much smaller number.
I'll come back to you if we have time, but I want to let everybody else have a chance. Yes, sir.
What do you make of the growing BDS boycott divestment strategy that seems like every day there's at least people on the left are joining, and trade unions and such? Is this really going to keep building momentum? And
Trade unions?
I know in Australia, for instance,
Oh, in Australia, not
unions
here.
have signed on to this growing movement.
Okay.
Will this continue, in your view?
I don't know if it will continue, but I do know that if you want a peaceful resolution to this, that the most important people are Israelis on the left who want the same thing, and they should be empowered. And a lot of the boycott actually boycotts those people. And it makes, Israelis feel like there's no place for them in the world. And if anything, it's sort of, you live outside the law. You push somebody outside the law, then they have to take responsibility for themselves. And that's when you get in situations like when Israel hit the nuclear reactor in Iraq. It's sort of like the thing to do is make an alliance with the Israeli left and empower them. And I think the boycotts, my opinion, have the opposite effect.
Yes, sir.
This is extremely hypothetical, but I'd like your opinion. If you took away anti-Semitism today, what would happen to the concept of Israel and a Jewish state, as opposed to the way we operate here, where all are welcome? Would they still be afraid of the demographic time bomb? Now, again, it's a hypothetical. There's no more anti-Semitism.
Right, well, I think that Israel sees itself not only as, as a Jewish state, but also as kind of a certain kind of Western European state in a way. And there's demographic issues all over the world, not just in Israel. So, but it's like to imagine no anti-Semitism. It's sort of like it's like because it's everything in the world that goes on with Jews, going way back that's the court on which the game is played. You know what I mean? So you're asking me to imagine a tennis match where there's no tennis court. It's hard for me to do. Could you do it?
We had a question over here, I think. Yes, sir.
So I've grown up in a place in the United States that treats separation of church and state as a virtue. And maybe it's because I don't have a lot of background, but I'm just wondering how to think about the situation where a group of people feels entitlement to a certain land due to metaphysical reasons, because the religion tells them that they have that entitlement. So, and especially if that ends up leading to things like war and people fighting and people dying. So I'm wondering if there's a non-metaphysical way to think about that. Why does a certain group of people have entitlement to a land, and why should I support anything but pluralism and a diffuseness of all the world's religions, ethnicities, people in every part of the world?
Well, where did you grow up?
United States.
Where?
New York State.
And you don't think there was anybody here before? I mean, the Iroquois and... I mean, honestly, it's the history of nations is terrible. And that's every nation in the world. Israel's a very late to the game nation. And the fact is, I mean, you talked about it being an ethnicity. And Greeks feel entitled to Greece in some way. So
I don't feel entitled to this land in any way. I think if anybody does, it's probably the Native Americans, but we kicked them out. But I wouldn't support natives saying, oh, well, we need to have a state of our own. I mean, why can't people
The
just
problem is
live
once you
together
start
in the
thinking
same
about
state?
it gets so complicated, and it's not so simple. It's not like you have, and I'm very critical of Israel, but it's not like you have little ethnically pure Israel, surrounded by the tolerant Muslim world where everybody's accepted. That's not the situation at all. The situation is that there's a, I believe I cannot go to Mecca, for example, because I'm Jewish. If you're Muslim, you can go to Jerusalem. Now, and so it's not, you have nations all over the place where people feel entitled. Now the question is, did Jews feel like they came from Europe and they came back? But now you're in a situation where the people that are Israeli now and live in Israel, they're born there. That's their home. They're not going anywhere. They're entitled to it just like you're entitled to anywhere where you're born. So what are you going to do? You're going to move those people? And what if you have a Palestinian whose grandparents were born in Egypt? Are they more entitled because they're Muslim? It's very, very complicated, and it's not so simple. And that's the whole thing with the boycott and everything else, because when you start looking at it, if it was easy, then it would be solved. But it's impossible, which is why it's not solved. And I feel like it's one of these situations where both sides are wrong and both sides are right. And there's not evil on just one side, and there's not good on just one side. And that's the problem. And I do feel like Israel and Palestine, they sort of need our help in getting over this and getting out of the situation, and it's important for the whole world.
Let me ask you about that, needing our help. That gets us back to politics, so to speak, into diplomacy. It was assumed for quite a while that the United States had a great deal of leverage in the Middle East situation between Palestinians and Israelis. The more time has passed and the more there have been efforts at peace solutions of one kind or another, the more it has appeared that we don't have that much leverage.
Right.
What's your own feeling about what we can or cannot do? And are we headed down the right road at the moment?
Well,
in terms
the
of an
fact is,
external power trying to influence things for the better?
I mean, the fact is you hear complaints in the Arab world that the United States is too close and gives too much money. But the fact is that's a good thing, because the United States is the only country that has any leverage, because it's Israel's only friend in the world. And that is why it's so important that the United States is part of a peace, because the United States does have some leverage, but you're right, there's a limit to that leverage. And the fact is, the United States was not, in 1967, when Israel fought that war, they weren't flying F-16s, they were flying French Mirages. And now you have a situation where the secret meeting, where Benjamin Netanyahu flies in the middle of the night to go talk to Putin, I believe, and you know that they're lining up other sources in other countries, So there is, I think that coded into the Israeli DNA is, it's better to be alive and hated than loved and gone, So, and there gets to a point where you reach that.
Rich, yes, we'll have one last question.
Suppose Iran does develop a nuclear bomb. I don't think suppose Iran does develop the bomb. Israel has the bomb. Wouldn't Iran be in the same position as Russia was when they had the bomb and crazy Stalin was in power? Any state with geographically defined borders would not, I don't think, want to be destroyed itself. Iran, with the bomb, knowing if they drop the bomb, God forbid, on Israel, would themselves be destroyed.
Right.
Their leaders might be difficult, but I don't think their leaders want to see their state be destroyed.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I think you have to hope for Iran that the idea that power corrupts, and that when that they want to survive, and you really see that with what's happened in Iran the last couple of months, which is they want to survive. Those people want to stay in power, and a way not to stay in power is to do what you're talking about. There's a feeling that there's an apocalyptic ideology, but it's like any other ideology. Once it becomes empowered in the real world, it starts to be diluted, and that's what you have to hope. You have to hope for the power of human greed and corruption will sort of cause Iran to be deterrable. And I mean, the fact is that it's worked in the past, and hopefully it'll work again, but it's very scary because of what they say. You know, but scary things have been said about Israel from the very, very beginning.
You got it. Israel is Real. It's a wonderful read, as well as terribly informative. And he's got quite a cast of characters in there, including somebody called Sam the Banana Man, who played a very important role in Israeli history. 2 Jewish kids from Cleveland who created Superman and what that was all about, and on it goes. I highly recommend the book, and I thank you for a terrific evening.
Thank you.
That was good, really good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.